All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Japan to Argentina to the United States. Thank you for connecting with us today on YouTube, Spotify, and our other social media platforms as we hear from sector leaders on the global impacts of the new U.S. government cybersecurity strategy. I am honored to be a senior advisor with Access Partnership for Cybersecurity. At AP, we want to see private and public entities embrace optimization, further innovation, and emerging technologies, and enable collaborative efforts in technology. As the White House identified, cybersecurity is essential to the basic functioning of our economy, the operation of our critical infrastructure, and the strength of our democracy and democratic institutions, the privacy of our data and communications, and our national defense. The criticality of cybersecurity is why it cannot be addressed in a siloed, insular topic to be fixed. Rather, we must see cybersecurity as the premise from which our societies and governments can more effectively communicate, collaborate, and transform harmoniously. We will discuss these efforts within the context of the strategy's pillars on shaping market forces, international partnerships, critical infrastructure, and investment. I am truly looking forward to the discussion today as we review the pillars of the U.S. cybersecurity strategy and excited to be on this virtual stage with these experts as they highlight best practices moving forward and concerns about the strategy's implementation within the U.S., with allies, and with partners. Today, we will start with a presentation and then move into a panel discussion, leaving time for Q&A, which you can do through the chat. So for very quick introductions, with us today are Phil Stupak, Assistant National Cyber Director for International within the Office of National Cyber Director, Cassie Crossley, Vice President for Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric, Mario de la Cruz, Senior Director for Public Policy and Government Affairs, Latin America at Cisco, Elliot Wilkes, Chief Technology Officer, Advanced Cyber Defense Systems. So let us begin with Philip Stupak. Phil currently serves as the Assistant National Cyber Director for International within the Office of the National Cyber Director in the Executive Office of the President. Yes, that is a lot of offices. But in this role, he is responsible for building cohesion within the U.S. government for internationally focused cybersecurity policies, engaging with foreign governments, and seeking to build consensus among friends, allies, and partners for affirmative action of cybersecurity. And this building a consensus and vision. With these ever-growing responsibilities, I also want to congratulate him on his extended tenure in this role as he now drives the efforts internationally. Phil is also an attorney who previously served as counselor to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security in the first year of the Biden-Harris administration. He worked on international cybersecurity matters in the Obama administration and was elections counsel in the U.S. House of Representatives. As if he had any spare time, which he claims he does, he teaches a master's level course on Introduction to Cyber Risk Management at the University of Chicago. Good morning, Phil. Thank you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to discuss the U.S. cyber strategy with us and tease out the intended global implications as it begins to be implemented. We are eager to hear from you on the strategy, but for this audience, most importantly, we look forward to hearing about the global efforts and intended impacts that you are spearheading through your office. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you very much. And also thank you to Access Partnership for inviting me to talk about the new National Cybersecurity Strategy. It's a momentous occasion for me, largely because I've been working on this for about 14 months or so, and I'm absolutely thrilled I can talk about it in public now. So let's just kind of go into an overview of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. Today, we face evolving threats from sophisticated nation-state adversaries and common cyber criminals alike. Our adversaries increasingly look to cyberspace as a venue to promote their values and advance their own parochial interests. And we all know that cyber is now commonly used to wage geopolitical conflict. As a global community, we must define and pursue an affirmative vision for the future of our shared digital ecosystem, a vision that recognizes that cyberspace's true purpose is to enable all of the amazing things that we want to do. Securing ourselves against threats is not the only thing that matters when it comes to cyberspace. In fact, it's not even really the main thing. Fixating on security is, in fact, a distraction, one our adversaries are all too happy for us to adopt. If we build a defensible, resilient cyber foundation, we can pursue our boldest goals with confidence. Goals like an electrical grid capable of distributing renewable energy across vast distances with pinpoint real-time precision. Goals like high bandwidth instantaneous communications that enable collaboration, commerce, and cultural exchange, just like today. And goals like an internet that upholds our commitment to rules-based international order. Each of these goals depends on and is enhanced by technology. And beginning with a strong cyber foundation is essential to their ultimate success. The National Security Strategy, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and other major administration initiatives are moving the United States towards a more equitable economy, a clean energy transition, a stronger democracy, and a more competitive workforce. This administration has been clear in its vision for America. We will protect these investments by increasing our collective security and systemic resilience. It is this affirmative vision for cyberspace that shapes President Biden's new National Cybersecurity Strategy. In the strategy, we aim to make our digital ecosystem more inherently defensible, resilient, and aligned with our values. Defensible means that we've tipped the advantage from attackers to defenders by designing systems where security is baked in, not bolted on. Resilience means that when defenses fail, which they sometimes will, the consequences are not catastrophic and recovery is seamless and swift. And we will tackle head-on the fact that technology shapes and is shaped by the rest of society. Technology does not itself represent a value system. It carries with it the values of its creators and operators. Technology can bring great advancement from groundbreaking vaccines to essential services for the underserved, but it can also be used to malign people and undermine confidence in our institutions. So we have to actively define and assert our priorities in the way we build our digital world. Past cyber strategies have been built on a foundation of information sharing and public-private collaboration. These have been essential efforts, but this strategy aims higher, to outpace our adversaries and set a national agenda on our terms rather than theirs. The National Cybersecurity Strategy builds on the President's work of the last 2 years, including Executive Order 14028 on improving the nation's cybersecurity, and National Security Memorandum 5, improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems, among other efforts and initiatives. This strategy also nests within the National Security Strategy vision of unprecedented government collaboration with civil society, private industry, and our international allies and partners, communities that were consulted extensively during its development. This input was essential and reflects a growing strategic convergence across both sectors and nations. But to achieve these objectives, we have to make two foundational shifts in the way our digital ecosystem works, shifts that, to date, the United States government has not required. The first shift, we need to rebalance responsibility for managing cyber risk, rethinking whom we ask to keep all of us secure. Today, across the public and private sectors, we tend to devolve responsibility for cyber risk downwards. We ask individuals, small businesses, local governments, who are often those with the least capable and the least resourced, to be our first and last lines of defense against the world's malicious cyber actors. This isn't just unfair, it's ineffective. The biggest, most capable, best positioned actors, be they public or private sector, can and should assume a greater share of the burden for mitigating cyber risk. Government must do a better job of leading by example, defending our own systems and sharing relevant and timely information with the private sector. And we expect the same leadership from industry. like cloud service providers and developers of software and manufacturers of hardware. We need to step up, work together, shoulder to shoulder, to re-architect our digital ecosystem so that responsibility for its security and resilience is more deeply woven into its technical and policy foundations. However, simply shifting the burden for security won't solve all of our problems if we don't start thinking about long-term solutions. So the second big shift in this strategy is the realignment of incentives to favor long-term investments. We all face very real near-term risks, legal requirements, and commercial incentives, but it's not enough to just manage the threats of today. We need to make tomorrow more inherently defensible and resilient so that those threats are made increasingly irrelevant. To do that, we need to make it so that when the public and private sector entities face trade-offs between easy but temporary fixes and harder solutions that will stand the test of time, they have the incentives they need to consistently choose the latter. So now looking at these two shifts, the strategy advances them across 5 pillars, as Tiffany mentioned at the beginning of today's conversation. First, we must defend critical infrastructure. We must give the American people confidence in the availability and resilience of our critical infrastructure and the essential services it provides. Second, we will disrupt and dismantle threat actors. We will use all the instruments of national power to make malicious cyber actors incapable of threatening the national security or public safety of the United States. Third, we will shape market forces to drive security and resilience. We will ensure market forces place responsibility on those within our digital ecosystem that are best positioned to reduce risk and shift the consequences of poor cybersecurity away from the most vulnerable, making our digital ecosystem more trustworthy. Fourth, we will invest in a resilient future. We will continue through strategic investments and coordinated collaborative action to lead the world in developing secure and resilient next generation technologies and infrastructure. Finally, we will forge international partnerships to pursue shared goals. We must promote a global cyberspace where responsible state behavior is expected and rewarded, and where responsible behavior is isolating and costly. Taken together, these 5 pillars reflect the reality that although the voluntary approaches to cybersecurity have achieved much, they have been inadequate to deliver the cybersecurity posture we need to enable our digital society. This strategy recognizes existing shortcomings and calls for change. It commits the government to pursuing minimum cybersecurity requirements in the sectors whose risk profiles require it. Further, the administration will use the authorities it has to establish those requirements where it can and work with Congress to establish new authorities where needed. We have been in deep conversation with industry about these proposals and have developed a framework for these requirements. Any new requirements or regulations will be highly targeted and based on the unique risks posed to each critical infrastructure sector. New and existing regulations will be harmonized to reduce the compliance burden on industry. Any new regulations will be developed collaboratively with industry so that they are cost aware and produce the outcomes we want. Now, what I find most encouraging about this affirmative vision and this strategy is how many other countries see things the exact same way. We all agree that our shared digital ecosystem should be made more secure in order to further our prosperity and our values. Now we have an opportunity to further deepen our collaboration and partnership to make this vision reality. And when I travel abroad or meet with delegations here in DC, I am thoroughly heartened to repeatedly hear the same 3 words: count us in. I hope we may also count each of you in. There's so much that we can accomplish together. So thank you to the organizers of Access Partnership for creating an excellent forum to have these discussions. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak. Tiffany, I believe you're still on mute.
Yep. Thank you, Phil. The scope and the intent of the strategy is quite remarkable. And I'm curious to see how the rest of the panel is also wanting to discuss how the strategy is wanting to rebalance the risk and the long-term incentives to actually move it forward. So I welcome your participation in the next section as our panelists from industry discuss some of these global implications for themselves or their industry. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce this distinguished panelist. First, we have Cassie Crossley. She is Vice President of Supply Chain Security in the Global Cybersecurity and Product Security Office at Schneider Electric. She is an expert cybersecurity technology executive in IT and product development with ample business and technical leadership experience in supply chain security, cybersecurity, software, firmware development, program management, and data privacy. Throughout her career, she has designed frameworks and operating models for end-to-end security in software development cycles, third-party risk management, and cybersecurity governance. So lots of those items that Phil highlighted of where we need those best practices. So we welcome Cassie. Second, we have Mario de la Cruz. He serves as the Senior Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs for Latin America at Cisco. Within this role, Mario drives IT, regulatory, and corporate policies through institutional relations with the national governments across the Latin American region. He has over 20 years of experience in private and public sectors, previously working for Citi, the World Bank, and the state of Tabasco in Mexico. Mario currently serves as a board member of the Mexican National Chamber of the Electronic Industry, Telecommunications, and Information Technologies, CENIETE, and apologies if I mispronounced that one, and chairman of the ICT committee at AmCham, Mexico. Welcome, Mario. And third, we have Elliot Wilkes. He is from Advanced Cyber Defense Systems. Elliot is a technologist with over 15 years of experience across the US, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, leading complex software development and digital transformation projects with acute cybersecurity needs. He has served as an advisor and technology leader at the White House, US Department of State, the US Department of Defense, United Nations, UK Ministry of Defense, and most recently, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. He now runs ACDS, a cybersecurity software and advisory firm working with clients and partners globally. So welcome all. Thank you so much for coming. So as I presented earlier, we're going to try and address some of these items within each of the pillars, so that way we can keep it more focused, but I love and welcome any comments as thoughts come to mind. So starting with shaping market forces, the US strategy has identified that those who are best positioned to reduce risk in the digital ecosystem should hold an increasing role and increasing responsibility in defending cyberspace. With this push for companies to refocus on cybersecurity of the digital ecosystem, Cassie, I would be curious to know your thoughts on how to help shape market forces. What is your company doing to address these security and resiliency efforts?
Hi, well, thank you for having me here. From a, let's see, resiliency and security, I think it's an always ever-reaching goal that we're working towards. For resiliency, especially taking into account, we work with from a global area, just around the world with government and customers. We have a large number in our extensive portfolio of critical infrastructure. So working on resiliency, both internally, but also with our customers for reference designs, architecture, threat modeling. We've participated in different events throughout the world as people prepare for resiliency and do simulations or certain activities in preparation for that. From a security aspect, we are a large company that has been involved in the standards development, both from a standards organization such as IEC 62443, which is Industrial Control System Standard, but also with the global different areas around the the world. We've participated in NIST's IoT baseline and many other NIST areas such as the CSF, the cybersecurity framework. I'm working right now with MITRE on the system of trust in regard to security and how Schneider Electric works with our security and resiliency. And so I think it's too many to name at this point. But we support the cybersecurity strategy that was released with the US and have been working in partnership with them and are eager to work with them on the implementation plans.
Thank you, Cassie. Mario, I'm going to ask a follow-up question to you. By shifting the cybersecurity burden to software products and services, how's your company reacting and adapting? Especially, what challenges do you foresee down the road?
No, thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Access Partnership, for the invitation. It's great to be here with Philip, with Cassie, and with Elliot. And first, at Cisco, we celebrate the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy. That's a great, of course, not only for U.S. citizens, but as a reference for the governments we work abroad, right? Particularly in my region across Latin America. And let me share with you that Cisco began our transformation into a software company back in 2015 when our CEO, Chuck Robbins, was appointed. And that's exactly when we put software in the heart of our business strategy. We think that's extremely relevant. And that's why our strategy currently is to help customers to connect, secure, and automate to accelerate the digital agility in a cloud-first world. I think that's very relevant to the transition at software. And most of our solutions right now are cloud-based. And Tiffany, more than reacting, we have been proactive by building networking solutions with built-in simplicity, security, agility, and automation that can be consumed as a service. Actually, in our previous fiscal year, services represented 26% of our revenue and is still growing, and we're in the path to have a more predictable source of revenue. So, and specifically in security, we believe a lot in flexibility, and that's why we are building simple, integrated, and high efficiency end-to-end security solutions, both delivered on premises or in the cloud. And we need that flexibility, particularly because some customers still prefer to have the solution on premise, or there are some countries, for instance, that the regulation forces to have on premise, for instance, national security topics in some countries. From my perspective and from what I have learned in the region, I think that one of the most important challenges is awareness. Still, unfortunately, we're not there in terms of awareness of the relevance of cybersecurity. And also, unfortunately, there are very significant and public cases that are raising this awareness. For instance, last year, we have a big cyber attack in the government of Costa Rica that basically paralyzed all government activity. Very unfortunately for the government of Costa Rica, we were able to help. But these type of cases, in just trying to see in a positive way, they help to raise the awareness that we need, right? So those are the main challenges the main challenge that we are seeing in the region from my perspective.
Thank you. And news highlighting the challenges is never a good thing. Hopefully we can be more collaborative as we move forward to help secure and prevent those. But Elliot, actually discussing security operations, let me ask you somewhat of a follow-up. As any business continually focuses on secure operations, what implications on safety, resilience, and operations do you see as you work with multinational companies to begin to address those items within the US strategy or even participate in the CISO's cyber hygiene services that launched in March of this year?
Absolutely. And thanks very much, Tiffany, and everyone for having me. So at ACDS, one of the things that we advise our clients on is helping. It's exactly as Mario said. It's understanding sort of the awareness. It's really giving often sort of C-suite executives the tools they need to inform the board to make the appropriate investments. So that looks, that could be in the form of investments in specific technologies to plug gaps, but also in terms of sort of, constantly reevaluating how you're assessing your cybersecurity. And so that could be through sort of regular testing and other things like this. And this is, I think, why I'm very excited to see CISA come out with the cyber hygiene services. This is something that we've been participating in a little bit with the UK, and what they've got a series of services, part of their active cyber defense portfolio. But effectively, this is, it's a scanning service that you can sign up for. It's kind of a government provided service, and it's really sort of checking some of those boxes that are sort of here's some of the minimum, and then some of what you need to be doing from a cybersecurity perspective. And I think the UK government has this with the NCSC, the Australian government and many others are starting to go in this direction where they're investing in some of these services to provide sort of a baseline coverage. But then for these really large organizations, it's making sure that they invest commensurate with the level of risk that they have, and having them truly appreciate and properly assess how much risk, given they've got assets across the globe, and kind of the state of threat actors at the moment.
Fantastic. And Phil, since you have the international portfolio and we're discussing how we're actually shaping market forces, are there any areas of key concern in this pillar that has come to light for you as the strategy has been released and now you're looking at implementation?
So implementation is ongoing. We began it before we released the strategy, so we are at least a couple steps ahead. And hopefully we will have a more public document that we can release ideally in the coming months. And perhaps we can have a follow-up conversation at that time. But when I talk to my colleagues across the globe, I think depending on the region, I get slightly different reactions, right? When I talk to my colleagues in the European Union, they look at us and go, it's about time. And they see the United States taking a large step towards their approach that they've had over the last decade. And what I've seen on market forces, what is really interesting to me though, there are small and medium-sized nations who have been trying to take this approach for years now, but because they lack the number of companies within their territory, they can only have so much influence. And so when the United States does take a step like this, it is meaningful for those countries. And so that is really where I've heard thanks from a lot of nations that we are finally catching up to what they've been trying to accomplish over the last couple of years. So I wouldn't say that there are challenges so much as a great set of opportunities for us to work with our international partners to make sure that all of us are more secure. I mean, fundamentally, we're all using the same products. We all have the same vulnerabilities. And so when we can take a big step forward on addressing those vulnerabilities together as a collection of nations, we are all going to be more secure in the end.
Completely agree. Which ties nicely into, so thank you for teeing up on international partnerships and discussing how things get coordinated, well-resourced approaches, especially as you mentioned, the small to medium-sized countries, when shifting different efforts from small and medium-sized businesses to those larger entities that are able to have more of a global defense. We recognize that we're all within a complex operational environment that crosses sectors, crosses domains, crosses borders, whether we want to acknowledge that on our data flow chart or not, it happens. So Mario, with that, I'm going to ask you the first question in international partnerships. How can companies leverage existing international agreements among like-minded partners, like the US and Mexico, Chapter 19 of the USMCA, for instance, to promote a more coordinated and synergistic effort among states? What are you helping drive within Cisco? What more can be done?
Thanks, Tiffany. So basically, we don't expect necessarily governments to harmonize the requirements of their legislation such as they mirror each other exactly. But as a global company, we work to bring best practices, to show to other governments what we believe is being done correctly. And we definitely believe that the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy is definitely a best practice that should be analyzed by other governments. So in our case, we're looking for commonly interoperable approaches that allow us for instance, cross-border flows of data and the ability to leverage trusted sources of technology, and I cannot stress this more, that are developed by trustworthy, responsible vendors, whether domestic or foreign. And that's exactly what the USMCA language is about. And I believe that's a great innovation and a competitive advantage for the North American region in the future, to foster a secure North American digital market. I had the opportunity to participate in those negotiations. Having a digital trade chapter that considers cybersecurity cooperation is a huge step forward. And of course, in the implementation, there has been progress, for instance, in the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico. Cybersecurity is one of the pillars of the high-level economic dialogue. But I think that one of the things that the governments needs to work, the governments of the three nations, and in alignment with the private sector, as Philip was mentioned, is we need to build what are the next steps and build a roadmap of what that cybersecurity cooperation within the USMCA really means. I think that's extremely important that we put these steps forward, and that will need the cooperation, particularly with the private sector. So that's what we have been seeing and doing in terms of USMCA in particular, but also in other regions against, making or bringing these best practices on cybersecurity.
Completely agree. If we all have a roadmap, we can all start to drive down the same path and be synergistic, or at least mirror, as you said, our efforts. So, Elliot, I know that you work with multinational companies all the time, especially as you're driving these efforts. How will this strategy further existing collaboration mechanisms between the US, its allies, and its partners? And especially with your experience in the area, what efforts will gain more momentum as we see companies start to identify where they own risk and where they're actually trying to help move things forward?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think it's exciting to see the team in the US taking a big step in sort of a great direction. One of the things that we've seen come out after this as the secure by design tech, which I think is a really exciting element that the UK, but also New Zealand and Australia and Germany, and I think there's several others as well, participated in. I was at a conference and saw them announce some of the work, and it was more than 9 countries, I think, participated. So very exciting to see that level of collaboration where this has traditionally been perhaps, a US and UK bilateral thing, or something where, something that's known as the Five Eyes partnerships. I think growing those alliances is really important because it allows for it sort of makes space for vendors to have safe and secure spaces to be able to collaborate, share threat intelligence, which I think is absolutely fundamental and critical. But also, I think if we look for opportunities for collective action, so when there are opportunities for sort of disrupting, known malicious activity by ransomware crews and things like this, I think that's really exciting, and I think that's something that I've seen a lot happen behind the scenes between the US and UK and other allies. And I think that's really sort of where we want to get to is working closely with the Ciscos and Microsofts and Schneiders and others that are sort of experiencing some of these things and working very closely with not just a single government but multiple governments as part of a coalition. I think that's really where we start getting to a level where we're protecting in percentage points the internet writ large.
Agree. It's very exciting. I'm curious to see how many more, not just 9, show up for your discussions, but how many more will be like-minded and want to secure it for everyone. So, Cassie, rounding out the international partnerships, you have been very active in international standards, developing frameworks, leading discussions around the world for Schneider Electric. What are the best practices and standards that you see helping to secure the digital ecosystem that have already been launched that you helped with or that are in development? And how will those only help further what the strategy is actually calling for?
Yes. Well, definitely, there's probably too many standards to list. As I mentioned, a couple, 62443, which is both an ISA and an IEC standard. So I think it's very important as we look at standards like ISO 27000 series and the various series, is that there are multiple standards organizations that do that recognition across. And also, when we're developing specifically at the national level, no matter what country, is using those standards with what are called informative references. And what that means is when NIST SSDF, which is a Secure Software Development Framework, came out, it has the list of all the connections to these standards. And what that will do is, let's say if you're not in the industrial control space and you want to follow an ISO standard on IoT, that you would understand where you may need to augment for something in regards to SSDF, or you might already be meeting everything in regards to that based off of who is asking you the questions. And what that does for everybody globally is it's allowing us to look at the requirements for certain things, but also keep them updated. You know, we can't update a standard every 2 months, right? It's a very long process. So for example, the SSDF had a few things that 62443 had not yet come to. There are cloud sections in certain areas that are not covered in other certain standards. And so we grow as a community when we have this international collaboration and not be set on just this is the one that I'm going to follow, but be open-minded and really look at it, just across from a development, but also an operational standpoint. There are different regulations from an operations. We work heavily in the utility space. And so working with the regulations and requirements for NERC, the North American Electrical Reliability Cooperative that is important. Which there's a different set for FDA that they're doing when they're examining medical devices. So I think this international partnership, especially with this cybersecurity strategy, is really focusing and not saying this is the one you must follow, but rather you should be following something that is a recognized best practice and standard and framework, and we will continue to grow and mature these as we go through, and evolve over the years.
Thank you. Phil, you look like you want to jump out of your chair and applaud Cassie outright. So any follow-up?
Absolutely. Yes. Standards are a pet rock of mine that I absolutely adore. I cannot agree more with Cassie on the need for them. But what we're also trying to make a push on is the idea of reciprocity between standards. So if you have a national standard, I'm not asking you to adopt the United States standard. We have our own unique culture and norms here within the United States. And that's why we create a standard for the United States. That is not the shared experience that you have in a different country. So we can have our separate standards, but what we're looking at is where can we build reciprocity between domestic standards? And hopefully that supports an international standard that, like Cassie was just saying, has those links back, right? The API crawls back to each of the individual national standards. So that is incredibly important. It's really where I think the most interesting things within the space are going to occur over the next decade are on these operational standards, because that effectively becomes norms for the space. We have attempted to do a top-down norm from an ivory tower over the last 20 years within cybersecurity, but I think this bottom-up approach to norms is going to be far more effective and bring more people in.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. So some of the things you've just highlighted and what Cassie was discussing are those items, especially when looking at control systems and operational technology, really get to the fundamental root of critical infrastructure. And one of the reasons why this cybersecurity strategy has been pushed forward so critically, especially among the rising wave of cyber attacks, the strategy is seeking to build confidence in the availability of these systems, the resiliency of the infrastructure, and to have it seen as an essential service that should never have a downtime, or if so, it can be minimal where it's not an operational impact. Elliot, want to ask you, because I know that you're working a lot with different critical infrastructure partners. How is ACDS supporting critical infrastructure resiliency? And what's the focus on coordination and awareness, especially when you're looking at the totality of infrastructure, from applications to programs to hardware, all operating with different systems? What do you propose as a best practice in the ways moving forward? How do you untangle that web?
So how do you fix everything? It's great. Honestly, it's a challenge, right? Because often we've seen this with companies, even sort of large companies. They have a series of technologies that are sort of operational technologies that all of a sudden, because one or another decision someone made at some point, all of a sudden are exposed to the internet, and those OT tech stacks were not built with that in mind. And so really helping companies understand sort of the threat landscape when they have these devices and systems plugged into the internet is really sort of a basic level thing that we work with, but also, moving to a higher maturity model, we work with companies also to deploy unconventional, let's say, detection techniques. And so that's things like deception technology and honeypots and other interesting bits of tech like that I think are new and novel and starting to get out there in a serious way. I think also there's a really interesting opportunity as we look at some of the new tools out there, so large language models and whatnot, being able to process large amounts of data to help the human actors who are trying to assess from a defensive perspective, and having them basically augmenting their ability to process all of that data coming in and act in a responsible way, and understanding what's a threat versus what's sort of noise. So those are some of the things that we offer in the sort of the infrastructure space.
Thank you. And Cassie, you mentioned critical infrastructure with all of your support for different clients. What steps is Schneider Electric taking to ensure resiliency and availability with those clients and with your technologies, particularly considering energy and automation digital solutions?
Yes. Well, I think supply chain security is a major portion of that. That means not only the suppliers that you currently have, but ones that you've used in the past, because whether you're working in critical infrastructure for current operations, we know in the especially critical infrastructure space, these operations need to be running 24/7 without a second of downtime. And so it's very important that the proper controls have been put in place for evaluation. As Elliot said, also making sure that their defenses are in line with current technologies. We have a initiative that we have announced with BitSite, where we are actually monitoring certain protocols that are in the OT space, things that should not be out there exposed to the internet. And so this install-based security initiative, having conversations with different customers and providing the proper reference architectures, and working with companies such as Elliott and other companies to make sure that they are implementing the effective defense measures as part of that, and even our own Schneider Electric services. One piece about the resiliency when it comes back to the supplier is, there is a deluge of vulnerabilities out there at this moment, and really the CISA program for known exploitability vulnerabilities, the KEV list, and really focusing on what is urgent and high of mind and of concern at this moment. So being aware, working with ISACs, with the industry consortiums, just other groups out there, especially on the threat intel space, to make sure that we're aware, because what a manufacturer and an operator such as ourselves on our digital platforms, we may see things. So partnering with global nations and also with their customers, because you can bring together that data and sort of have that more global view than even just a single country can have.
That's really important, that it is more cross-cutting and not a single country viewpoint. Before we move off the topic of critical infrastructure, Phil, I'm going to ask you, not all critical infrastructure, I know that there are many, have the same priority by the different agencies within the federal government. Within the Office of the Executive and coordinating with CISA, has there been a roadmap to identify how critical infrastructure is going to be prioritized to help make sure these efforts, or is it all of a coalition of the willing, or a little bit of both?
It's certainly a little bit of both. That being said, I mean, obviously our attention is focused on the traditionally underserved critical infrastructure sectors, ones like water, that have not received the same level of attention that perhaps financial services have over the last 2 decades. And you probably saw, in conjunction with releasing the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the EPA also released new standards for water, right, that we are beginning to implement. So really, I mean, the easiest way to think about this is, what are the critical infrastructure sectors that lead to death, right? We're going to be looking at power, water, those things that if we do not get this right, the harm is exacerbated beyond the concerns for some of the other sectors. So those are the ones that are really driving what we are focused on today. That being said, this is a sectoral approach. There are some sectors that are very advanced, again, like financial services. We will keep working with them to ensure that they have best practices. And also, how can we reduce regulatory burden on those sectors, right? They should not have to fill out the exact same form 10 different times for 10 different agencies. How can we reduce that burden? Versus those where, again, death is the potential outcome, that we really do need to have a suite of requirements that ensure that the worst cannot come to bear.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As a citizen who drinks the water and likes their power on here in the US. So actually moving to investments, Maria, I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to pull you first. With the US strategy identifying how investments should be coordinated, collaborative, and reduce technical vulnerabilities, and with Cisco's push in this software atmosphere, I'm curious to know what you're doing in this space. Have you seen the impact of the privacy regimes, the new cybersecurity laws in other countries, and how the US strategy is going to truly help with the investment in those countries and with like-minded partners of yours? Will it truly support the investment in emerging markets?
Yes, Tiffany. So we definitely have seen a significant influence of policy and regulation coming from the US or the European Union. Some analysts are calling it a regulatory wave coming to the tech sector and into a region. I think that GDPR is a great example. It's a European Union fostered this privacy regulation that has definitely become a global standard. We hope that the cybersecurity strategy of the US will be definitely a reference globally for the other countries. But we have seen, two sides of the story. So on one side, we're seeing countries and regions, and we see that in strategy too, talking about the need to build up cybersecurity local or national capabilities independent of global markets, but at the same time, they recognize that they cannot really go by themselves or go it alone. So So I will go back to the point of that Philip was making about values. So we need to leverage those relationships that we have with friends, allies, neighbors, strategic partners who share our values, and that's particularly relevant because there are plenty of malicious actors or state nations that do not share these values. So we need to focus on those whose success is intertwined with our own, like it has happening in North America with the USMCA. As I was mentioning, we're working to bring those best practices to the regulators across the region to help them find their own path, particularly in Latin America, that sometimes the region is seen as a unity, which it's certainly not. There are many countries. Brazil is a great example how they always try to find their own way in terms of the regulation. One of the things that we're doing at Cisco is, for instance, we're partnering with very trusted partners like the Organization of American States, with whom we share definitely these values, and we are promoting cybersecurity innovation, awareness, digital skills development in Latin America with great results. We developed this space of dialogue called Cybersecurity Innovation Councils with focus on Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and most recently in Central America, where governments, the public sector, the private sector, the academia, and the society, we are having these dialogues on what are the critical cybersecurity issues in each country and proposing solutions that we all can implement together, and it's having great results so far. So.
Thank you, Mario. And one last question, because I know that I want to leave time for Q&A. Cassie, I know that you and I had discussed in particular, part of the investment was actually in the cybersecurity workforce. Where do you see the sector mobilizing sufficient resources for cybersecurity research development, cybersecurity workforce development, and what do you see as the trickle-down effects in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yes, so I was just actually on the CISA page yesterday looking at their OT training and their really what they are doing and providing from a free standpoint of training. I think that this is part of the larger US initiative in regards to we need to upskill our workforces. We have, let's just say from an OT standpoint, not only do we have a more mature and the longevity of the footprint is very long. And so for those that may be especially maturing or going into retirement, we need to do more to educate those coming into the security field and workforce in regards to OT. I think a lot of the work that Elliot, a lot of the work that others are doing is specifically around that. So I highly encourage we support those models, both with just from a critical infrastructure, but just general infrastructure. I don't think that people fully recognize their even IoT footprint that is out there and the risks that can be enabled. So I think that those are a significant portion. On the R&D side, it's actually the same conversation. Working with different universities, different programs, and the workforce to be able to educate those. I know it may be really cool to be just working on cloud and SaaS all the time, but we don't, that infrastructure that it's on and running on are data center systems, such as the ones we sell. And so that requires education on embedded software and the risks in that layers. So I think that there's more that we can continue to do from a university standpoint and some of the different programs globally in order to support still that continued computer engineering topic. I think that'll make a big difference if we stay on that path and not just expect AI to generate everything for the moment.
Thank you, Cassie. So I want to move to some of the questions that we've already fielded. And I guess I'm going to put these together because I know that Phil had to step away for a moment. So I guess what parts, and Elliot and Mario, I'm curious to know your inputs on this, is what laws do you see currently addressing critical infrastructure and cybersecurity for the way that moving forward in this strategy, which is a best practice component and not necessarily an executive order, which then becomes mandated law, but it's that best practice framework. So understanding that, what type of laws do you currently encounter in your work globally that is helping to address cybersecurity and critical infrastructure?
Well, I can start from what I've seen, Tiffany, in the region, and I will speak only about Latin America. It has been very difficult for the national governments to pass laws around cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, of course, for political reasons, but always there are certain players in each country, and this has happened in Mexico, in Colombia, in other places, that where there's a start of discussing a cybersecurity initiative that considers critical infrastructure, but other topics, the public debate always deviates to, the fact of, is the government trying to spy on the citizens, and also, and it has become extremely difficult for the governments to pass these bills. And I think that's very unfortunately, because we need those bills. In the case of Mexico, we definitely need an update of the legislation. We need to typify the cyber crimes, because they are not considered currently in the law, and we need to be very specific. We need to put, how is this cooperation with the private sector? Because, for instance, in Mexico, 80% of the critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. So we need these frameworks to be passed on bills, but it has been extremely difficult for the governments to be passed, because it always creates a not necessarily technical debate around cybersecurity and protecting critical infrastructure. That's what I've been seeing in the region.
And Elliot, with your work in the UK, back here across the pond in the US, but also with all of your clients in the EU, Middle East, and Africa, what are you seeing?
I mean, I'd echo the same sentiment. I think there's always a concern around the integrity of a service, especially as you're talking about sort of sovereign technology. I think has become a real sort of buzzword, and I think there's elements of that are true. But I think one of the biggest challenges that I have, and this is both from my time previously as a government person informing policy making, and now sort of on the private sector side, is those are not always informed or as informed as they need to be by sort of technical people. And so I think there's a real challenge there. Sometimes if you're looking at even banning specific technologies, Huawei and some of those conversations, right? Like that became a highly politicized element versus a highly technical conversation. And so I think the places where you're able to make the most good or have the best results are the ones where you have, I think, lawmakers working closely with technical advisors to be able to come up with something that's very sensible. But there's a geopolitical element to that. I think from our perspective, we like to work with clients and help advise, help them try to stay, advance of at least some of the legislation that's currently sort of being proposed in the UK to allow for, I think, greater protection from in collaboration with government to disrupt threats, which I think is certainly the direction the U.S. is suggested is going as well.
Thank you.
And can I just mention real quick also that European Union's NIS2, NIS2, and also the Cyber Resilience Act, CRA, are also focusing quite a bit on critical infrastructure in the EU.
Phil, did you want to jump in?
No, actually, I was going to say the exact same thing on NIS2 in the European Union. It very much mimics the approach that we have taken in the United States of determining critical infrastructure sectors, not done necessarily at the legislative level, but done at the executive level under Presidential Policy Directive 21. We have 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Each has a regulatory body who's responsible for it. That largely grew up out of the post 9/11 regulatory environment, but now it's being applied with cybersecurity in mind as well, largely because our operational entity is CISA, which is, I remind people of this all the time, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They're not only responsible for the digital environment, but the physical OT environment as well.
Yes. And I apologize to all the viewers who need to jump off, but I want to thank our panelists and Phil, our presenter, for taking time today to speak with us on all the importance of what's happening with the US cybersecurity strategy, concerns about its implementation, the way that we can address using our best practices for information technology, cybersecurity, operational technology, and truly looking to rebalance this risk, not from an individual, but to how we can do this more holistically, collaboratively, and look at it in the long term for the incentive for our communities, our civil societies, and our governments to be more secure by design and be in a place where we're not talking about geopolitical risk, but geopolitical support for each other in this technology future. So with that, thank you all for joining today on our different social media platforms. We look forward to seeing you at our next events. In the meeting chat, there is a hyperlink that you can use to register for future events. And we look forward, Cassie, Mario, Elliot, Phil, to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.